The first sign wasn't the transfers or the late nights. It was the way he said my name like it weighed nothing. Camille. Flat. Dismissive, like a placeholder you plan to replace later. I stood at the kitchen sink that night, warm water running over my hands, listening to my husband talk on the phone in the den, laughing softly in that private voice he never used with me anymore. I didn't need to hear the words to know I wasn't part of the picture he was painting. People always thought I was slow to notice things, quiet, unbothered, forgettable. My in-laws treated me like background noise at family dinners, sliding conversations right past me as if I were furniture. My husband treated me like convenience, someone who made his life smoother without asking for too much space in it. And the community, they saw a woman who kept her head down, worked hard, and minded her business. They never questioned that last part, and I never corrected them. That night, when he ended the call and walked into the kitchen, he didn't even try to hide the smile still lingering on his face. He kissed my cheek like it was muscle memory, not affection. "You're quiet," he said. "I usually am," I replied. He nodded, satisfied. That was the version of me he depended on, the woman who didn't ask questions, didn't press, didn't disrupt his plans. But after he went to bed, I stayed up. I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet I'd been quietly maintaining for months. Dates, times, transfers, small amounts at first, just enough to go unnoticed, then larger, then frequent. Patterns always tell the truth if you give them enough time. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't pray for clarity. I observed. I copied bank statements and saved them to a drive he didn't know existed. I photographed documents he left carelessly on his desk, contracts that didn't quite line up, signatures that didn't quite match. I listened when his sister talked too freely about business moves at Sunday dinners. I asked questions softly, like I was just trying to learn, and they answered me. Weeks passed, then months. He grew lighter, freer, already halfway gone. When he finally sat me down at the dining table, his hands folded like he was delivering bad news he thought I couldn't survive, I almost admired the confidence. "I've been unhappy," he said, "for a long time." I nodded. "I think we both deserve a fresh start." I nodded again. "There's someone else," he added, watching closely now, waiting for the break. Still, I nodded. He frowned. "You're not upset?" I looked at him then, really looked, at the man who thought my silence was weakness, who believed my stillness meant ignorance. "No," I said calmly. "I wish you luck." The relief on his face was instant. He smiled, actually smiled like he'd escaped something difficult without consequence. That smile stayed with him for weeks, until the morning his accounts were frozen, until his phone started ringing with numbers he didn't recognize, until his business license was suspended pending investigation, until the woman he left me for called him screaming about a subpoena she didn't understand. I didn't say a word, because by then, everything I needed had already been handed over to the right people in the right order with receipts. I didn't act out of anger. I acted because I had learned long ago survival doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience, like preparation, like a woman everyone underestimates standing still enough to be ignored until she decides it's time to move. And when I finally did, no one saw me coming. Silence is a powerful disguise. People mistake it for emptiness, for absence, for a lack of thought. They don't realize silence is often where the most careful thinking happens. I had lived inside that misunderstanding for most of my marriage, letting people underestimate me because it kept me safe, invisible, unchallenged. After he told me he was leaving, the house felt lighter in a way that surprised me, not lonelier. Not broken, just quieter. He packed his things quickly, almost joyfully, as if he were stepping into a life he'd already rehearsed. He didn't argue over furniture, didn't fight about finances. That alone should have worried him, but he was too busy believing his own narrative. "You're taking this better than I expected," he said one afternoon, folding shirts into a suitcase. "I've had time to process," I replied. That part was true, just not in the way he thought. He kissed my forehead before he left, a gesture meant to signal kindness, maybe even guilt. I let him. Closure doesn't always need resistance. Sometimes it needs space. Once the door closed behind me, I sat at the dining table for a long time without moving. I listened to the refrigerator hum, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the sound of my own breathing. Then I stood, walked into the spare bedroom I'd quietly turned into my office, and locked the door. This was where the real work lived. I laid everything out, documents spread across the desk, labeled folders stacked neatly, timelines mapped in ink and color-coded tabs, bank transfers that didn't match income, contracts filed under one company but paid through another, joint funds rerouted in ways that required intention, not accident. Every detail told the same story. He hadn't just been planning to leave me, he'd been planning to leave me with nothing. What hurt wasn't the realization itself, it was how familiar it felt, like my instincts had been whispering for years and I'd finally given them permission to speak out loud. I contacted no one that first week. No family, no friends, definitely no in-laws. I let them assume whatever made them comfortable, that I was heartbroken, that I was in denial, that I'd fall apart soon. Meanwhile, I scheduled consultations, quiet ones. I didn't announce myself or overshare. I asked precise questions and listened carefully to the answers. I learned which agencies handled what constituted suspicion versus proof, where timelines overlapped in ways authorities paid attention to. I never used emotional language. I didn't frame myself as a victim. I framed myself as a witness. One afternoon, my sister-in-law called. Her voice was sweet in that artificial way that always came out when she wanted information without appearing intrusive. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm adjusting," I said. "Well, you know, this kind of thing can get messy. It's probably best not to dig too deeply. Stress isn't good for you." I smiled to myself. "I agree," I said. "Clarity is healthier." There was a pause, just long enough. "Anyway," she said quickly, "if you need help understanding paperwork or anything, let me know." "I will," I replied, and I meant it, just not in the way she assumed. Weeks passed. He stopped checking in. That told me everything I needed to know. Men who feel secure don't look back. Men who believe they've won don't check the score. The first official letter arrived on a Tuesday, plain envelope, government seal. I opened it calmly, read it carefully, and placed it into the correct folder. Then another came, and another. Each one confirmed what I already knew. By the time his business partners started calling me, confused, nervous, looking for answers, I understood just how far-reaching his assumptions had been. He never imagined I'd be included in conversations like this, never imagined people would look to me for clarity. "He didn't realize how exposed this was," one of them said. "He didn't," I replied. The day the accounts froze, I was making tea. Chamomile. The kettle whistled just as my phone began to vibrate across the counter, his name lighting up the screen for the first time in weeks. I didn't answer. Then came the messages, short at first, then frantic, then accusatory. "What did you do? This has to be a mistake. Call me, now." I turned my phone face down and poured the water. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel revenge. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing you prepared for this moment long before it arrived. Because while he was planning his escape, I was planning my survival. And survival, when done right, doesn't announce itself. It simply happens, quietly, decisively, and all at once. When people talk about betrayal, they always focus on the moment it explodes, the shouting, the tears, the slammed doors. They don't talk enough about the long stretch before that, the quiet season, the part where you feel something shifting but can't yet name it. That's where I lived for years. That's where I learned how to wait. After the accounts froze, the world around my husband began to wobble. Not collapse all at once, just enough to unsettle him, enough to make him reach for control the only way he knew how. He showed up at the house 3 days later without calling. I watched him through the front window as he stood on the porch, tapping his foot, adjusting his jacket, rehearsing whatever version of himself he planned to present. Confident, wronged, reasonable. He still believed I was a conversation he could manage. I didn't rush to the door. When I finally opened it, I didn't invite him in. I stood there calmly, blocking the doorway with nothing but posture. "We need to talk," he said, forcing a smile. "I disagree," I replied. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's happening." "I understand enough," I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like we were conspiring instead of unraveling. "Someone's made a serious accusation. My accounts are locked. The business is under review." I tilted my head slightly. "That sounds stressful." "You know this could affect you too," he said quickly. "Our names are connected." "They were," I corrected, past tense. That's when the mask slipped. Just a crack, but I saw it. "You always did think you were smarter than you were," he snapped. "You don't even know what you're messing with." I met his eyes without flinching. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he scoffed, the old confidence rushing back in to cover the fear. "You wouldn't do something like this. You're not built that way." That was the sentence that sealed everything. He turned and walked away, still convinced this was temporary, still convinced I was reacting emotionally, not strategically, still convinced that the woman he underestimated would eventually fold. I closed the door and locked it. That afternoon, I drove to a small office park on the edge of the city. Nothing flashy, no signs announcing importance, just neutral walls and quiet professionalism, the kind of place where people don't waste words. I didn't bring drama with me. I brought documents. I explained patterns. I explained timelines. I explained intent. I showed how joint funds were redirected, how contracts were falsified, how taxes didn't line up with reported income. I answered questions calmly, precisely, without embellishment. When I finished, the man across the desk leaned back in his chair. "Why now?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Because I have enough." He nodded. "You understand this will escalate." "Yes," I said. "That's the point." By the end of the week, whispers had turned into calls, not to him, to me. People looking for clarification, for reassurance, for distance. His social circle was shrinking in real time, and he didn't even know it yet. My in-laws called next. His mother's voice carried that familiar tone, concern wrapped around criticism. "We heard things are complicated." I agreed. "You know how stress affects him. This isn't the time to make things worse." I breathed in slowly. This is exactly the time to tell the truth. Silence. "We raised him better than this." "I'm sure you believe that," I replied. The call ended shortly after that. No resolution, no apology, just distance. I welcomed it. That night, I sat alone in the house I was preparing to leave. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, labels clear, decisions already made. I wasn't running, I was transitioning. My phone buzzed again, a message from an unfamiliar number. "You think you're untouchable now," it read. I didn't respond, because fear loses its power when you recognize it for what it is, noise from someone who no longer controls the outcome. I turned off my phone, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the quiet. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like erasure. It felt like space. And space, I was learning, is where you rebuild yourself carefully, deliberately, without permission. He still thought this was a misunderstanding, but misunderstandings don't come with evidence, and consequences were already in motion. By the time consequences begin to show themselves, most people have already chosen denial. It's easier to believe the world is wrong than to admit you misjudged the one person you thought you understood. My husband lived inside that denial comfortably. I could feel it in the way he stopped calling and started sending messages instead, carefully worded, indirect, as if speaking too plainly might make everything real. I ignored them all. Instead, I focused on what came next. Survival doesn't end when exposure begins. That's when it actually gets harder. That's when the emotional backlash arrives, when people start questioning your motives instead of the behavior that forced your hand. The rumors started quietly. I heard them through others before they reached me directly. That I was bitter, that I'd planned this from the start, that I was punishing him for leaving instead of letting go gracefully. The narrative shifted from what he did to how I reacted. It always does. I let it happen. I didn't defend myself. I didn't clarify. I didn't rush to correct the story. People who are committed to misunderstanding you aren't looking for truth. They're looking for reassurance that nothing about their world needs to change. What mattered was what was happening behind the scenes. The first formal interview came on a Wednesday morning. I arrived early, dressed simply, carrying a folder so organized it almost felt like armor. The woman across the table asked me to explain, from the beginning, how I discovered the discrepancies. I didn't discover them all at once, I said. I noticed patterns. She nodded. Tell me about the patterns. So I did. I spoke about timing, about repetition, about how money moved differently depending on who was watching, about how certain transactions always coincided with travel, with meetings I wasn't invited to, with explanations that never quite answered the question being asked. I didn't accuse, I described. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "You're very composed," she said. "I had time to prepare," I replied. Preparation has a way of steadying your voice. After that meeting, things accelerated quickly. Requests for additional documentation, clarifying questions, cross-checks. Each step confirmed that what I had sensed wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. And pattern recognition, once documented, becomes proof. That's when his panic finally broke through the surface. He called late one night, his voice sharp, brittle, unfamiliar. "You think you're smarter than everyone?" he snapped. "You've embarrassed me." I held the phone away from my ear until his voice lowered. "You didn't embarrass yourself?" I asked calmly. "This didn't have to be public," he said. "You made it public when you involved joint funds," I replied. He went quiet. Then came the accusation, the one men like him always reach for when control slips away. "You're doing this because you're angry." "No," I said. "I'm doing this because I'm finished pretending." He hung up. The next day, his sister sent a message that tried to sound supportive while fishing for information. "People are worried about you. This stress can't be healthy." "I'm managing, thank you." She didn't respond again. That was the moment I understood something important. They were no longer trying to stop what was happening. They were trying to understand how much worse it could get. I began packing in earnest after that, not in a rush, not emotionally. I sorted through my life with intention. Things I'd kept out of obligation went into donation bags. Items tied to memories that no longer fit were released without ceremony. I wasn't erasing my past, I was editing it. The house felt different as it emptied, not hollow, honest. One afternoon, as I carried a box to my car, a neighbor approached cautiously. "I heard about what's going on," she said. "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry," I replied. She hesitated. "You seem okay." I smiled gently. "I am." She nodded, confused, then walked away. People expect devastation to look a certain way. They expect brokenness. They expect collapse. What they don't expect is clarity. They don't expect a woman who has already grieved quietly to stand upright when the storm finally breaks. The official notice arrived 2 weeks later, investigation expanding, additional parties named, potential charges pending. I read it once, then again, then I placed it neatly in the folder and closed it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Not because it was over, but because I knew I had done exactly what I needed to do, exactly when I needed to do it. He still believed this would somehow circle back to him being the victim, but I understood something he didn't. The woman they never saw coming was already gone, and the one standing in her place was done being underestimated. Leaving a marriage doesn't happen the day someone walks out. It happens in layers. First, emotionally, then mentally, finally, practically. By the time the investigation widened and his name began circulating in places it never should have, I was already standing on the last layer, untangling my life from his with deliberate care. I found a small rental across town. Nothing fancy. Clean lines, quiet neighbors, windows that let in morning light without asking permission. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not out of fear, but out of choice. Privacy felt like oxygen. The day I moved, I took only what I needed: clothes that fit the woman I was becoming, documents I'd protected for months, a few photos. The rest stayed behind, like a shell I no longer required. He tried to contact me again that week, this time through mutual acquaintances, people who meant well but didn't understand that neutrality often favors the wrong side. "He's under a lot of pressure," one friend said gently. "Maybe you should talk to him for closure." "I already have closure," I replied. "What if this ruins him?" another asked. I paused before answering. What ruined him wasn't exposure, it was behavior. That usually ended the conversation. Behind the scenes, the fallout was accelerating. His business partners distanced themselves quickly, self-preservation masquerading as principle. Contracts were suspended, meetings canceled, invitations rescinded. The man who once moved comfortably through rooms full of affirmation was suddenly standing alone, watching doors close without explanation. And still, people looked at me like I was the anomaly. I noticed it at the grocery store, at the bank, in passing conversations where voices lowered when I approached. Some people were curious, some were cautious, some were quietly impressed, though they'd never say it out loud. Black women aren't often allowed complexity in moments like this. We're expected to be either broken or bitter, victim or villain. Strength makes people uncomfortable when it doesn't come packaged with apology. I didn't apologize. One afternoon, I received a formal request for another interview. This time it was different, more structured, more serious. I reviewed everything again the night before, not because I doubted myself, but because precision matters when truth is finally being weighed. During the interview, I was asked why I hadn't confronted him sooner, because confrontation without leverage is just noise, and noise doesn't protect you. The room went quiet. I explained how I learned to observe instead of react, how I documented instead of accuse, how survival taught me patience long before this marriage tested it. I spoke plainly, without dramatics, without framing myself as extraordinary. I did what I had to do. That's all. Afterward, I sat in my car for a long time before driving away. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. My chest didn't feel tight. My thoughts weren't racing. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for validation anymore. That realization changed everything. The next blow came from his family. A letter, not handwritten, typed, formal, calculated. It spoke of disappointment, of embarrassment, of how things should have been handled privately. It never mentioned accountability. It never mentioned the harm done. I read it once, then I shredded it. I didn't owe them understanding when they never offered me protection. That night, I stood in my new kitchen, barefoot on cool tile, making dinner for one. The silence wasn't lonely, it was intentional. I ate slowly, cleaned up, sat by the window and watched the city settle into evening. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what came next, not in reaction to him, but in service to myself. I thought about skills I'd spent years sharpening quietly, about consulting work I'd done informally, unpaid, unnoticed, about how often people came to me for solutions while never seeing me as strategic. I smiled. Underestimation, I realized, doesn't just protect you from harm, it gives you room to plan. My phone buzzed late that night, a single message from an unknown number. You don't know who you're dealing with. I stared at the screen, then set the phone down without replying, because I did know exactly who I was dealing with. A man running out of options, and a woman who no longer needed to explain herself to anyone. The balance had shifted completely now, and the most dangerous part, for him, was still ahead. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes, quietly, in pieces so small the person losing it convinces themselves it's temporary. That's what was happening to him now, even if he couldn't admit it yet. Every day, another thread loosened, another door closed, another assumption failed him. I felt it before I heard it. The call stopped coming through friends, the indirect messages dried up, even his sister went silent. Silence, when it comes from people who used to feel entitled to you, is never accidental. It's fear dressed as distance. The next interview came with a different tone, fewer pleasantries, more structure, more weight. I noticed it immediately, the way questions were phrased, the way notes were taken, the way certain names were repeated. This wasn't information gathering anymore. This was confirmation. At one point, the man across the table looked up and asked, "Did you ever benefit personally from these transactions?" "No," I said without hesitation. "I lost access to joint funds. I covered household expenses alone. I downsized my life while he expanded his." He nodded slowly. "That aligns with what we're seeing." Alignment. That word settled into me like truth finding its spine. After that meeting, I walked out into crisp afternoon air and felt something unfamiliar move through me. Not relief, not triumph, but certainty. The kind that doesn't need reassurance, the kind that knows the outcome before it arrives. That evening, I received an email from an old acquaintance, someone who'd once dismissed me as helpful but not ambitious. "I heard what's going on," she wrote. "If you ever want to talk about consulting work, let me know." I read it twice, then smiled. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting to chaos, but choosing from clarity. When you've spent years surviving, it's easy to confuse opportunity with escape. I wasn't escaping anymore. I was building. The formal notice arrived 3 days later. Charges being considered, assets under extended review, travel restrictions pending. I read it slowly, absorbing the language, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. This was the consequence of choices layered over time. This was gravity finally doing its job. He tried once more to reach me after that, a voicemail, his voice strained, stripped of authority. "You didn't have to take it this far," he said. "We could have handled this between us." I listened all the way through before deleting it. Between us had never protected me. Between us had cost me years. Between us was exactly where the damage had lived. I spent that night reorganizing my small apartment, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed motion. I labeled folders, backed up files, archived everything I no longer needed immediate access to. Preparation had become second nature, and I no longer questioned it. The following week, word reached me through someone who didn't realize they were delivering news. "He's not doing well," they said cautiously. "People are distancing themselves." I nodded. "That happens." "What will you do if he apologizes?" they asked. I didn't answer right away. Apologies don't undo patterns. Change does. They didn't know what to say after that. I began outlining my consulting framework that same week, not formally, not yet, just notes, observations, processes I'd refined quietly over years of solving problems no one credited me for: financial cleanup, risk assessment, quiet recovery planning, survival translated into strategy. It felt natural, like something I'd always been doing, just without a name. One morning, as I reviewed my notes, my phone buzzed with an alert. His business license suspended. I stared at the screen for a long moment. This was the milestone he never imagined. Not the frozen accounts, not the interviews. This, identity stripped, authority revoked, the version of himself he relied on evaporating in real time. I set the phone down and made breakfast. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just forward motion. That afternoon, I signed the lease on my new place, a year commitment, clean slate. I didn't negotiate aggressively. I didn't rush. I chose stability over symbolism. As I walked out of the leasing office, keys warm in my palm, I understood something clearly for the first time. I wasn't rebuilding from ruins. I was redirecting momentum. The quiet woman they never saw coming hadn't been waiting for revenge. She'd been preparing for independence, and now that preparation was finally paying dividends. But there was still one piece left unresolved, not legally, socially, and when that piece fell, everything would follow. Social fallout moves differently than legal fallout. Courts run on evidence and timelines. Communities run on perception, loyalty, and denial. I knew long before the investigation expanded that this part would be the most unpredictable, not because the truth wasn't strong enough, but because people don't like seeing familiar men exposed, especially not by quiet women they never bothered to understand. The first shift came at church. I hadn't gone in weeks, not out of shame, out of strategy. I needed distance before walking back into a space where assumptions traveled faster than facts. But one Sunday morning, I woke up with clarity instead of caution. I dressed simply, neutral colors, no armor, no performance, just myself. When I walked in, conversations paused. Not dramatically, subtly. The kind of pause that tells you your name has been spoken in rooms you weren't invited into. I greeted people politely, sat where I always had, listened, observed. Halfway through the service, I felt eyes on me, not curious, not kind, measuring, as if people were trying to decide what version of me they were allowed to believe in. The faithful wife, the bitter ex, the woman who went too far. Afterward, a woman I'd known for years approached me near the exit. Her smile was tight. "I've been meaning to reach out," she said. "This must be hard." "It's clarifying," I replied. She blinked, thrown off by my tone. Well, she continued carefully, you know people are saying all kinds of things. I imagine they are, I said. She leaned closer. Some think you planned this. I met her eyes. I planned to protect myself. The conversation ended shortly after that. Outside, the sun felt warmer than expected. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, letting my breath settle. This was the peace I'd been anticipating, the moment when silence would no longer shield me from judgment, when being composed would be mistaken for being calculating. I accepted it. That week, invitations stopped coming, not abruptly, selectively. Dinners I'd usually be included in moved to dates I wasn't available. Group chats went quiet when I spoke. People didn't confront me, they avoided me. Social distancing has nothing to do with health when accountability makes people uncomfortable. I didn't chase explanations. Instead, I focused on building what came next. I met with 2 potential clients, both women navigating financial separation after long marriages. They didn't come to me because of my story. They came because someone mentioned I was good at untangling things. We sat across from each other at a cafe, notebooks open, coffee cooling as conversation deepened. I don't need drama, she said. I just need to survive this without losing everything. I nodded. Then we'll focus on clarity, not chaos. It was the first time I said it out loud. Clarity, not chaos. It felt like a mission statement. The work energized me, not in an adrenaline way, but in a grounded, purposeful way. I was using skills I'd honed in silence for years, finally directing them towards something that belonged to me. And that's when the rumor reached me, not from gossip, but from someone who sounded genuinely shaken. He's telling people you set him up, that you were waiting for the right moment. I exhaled slowly. I was waiting to be sure. That's not how he's framing it. I know, I said. He was rewriting the story now, not legally, but socially, casting himself as the victim of a cold, calculating wife, a woman who smiled while destroying him. The narrative was neat, palatable, easier than accepting that his downfall was self-engineered. What unsettled people wasn't what I did, it was how calmly I did it. Men are allowed rage, women are allowed tears, but a woman who moves deliberately without spectacle disrupts expectations, and disrupted expectations often turn into suspicion. I received a message from an elder at church later that week, a request to talk things through, neutral language, careful wording, a meeting framed as concern. I considered declining, then I reconsidered. Not because I owed anyone reassurance, but because this conversation would decide something important, whether I would continue shrinking myself to fit communal comfort or stand in my truth without explanation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I marked it on my calendar. That night, alone in my apartment, I stood at the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. I felt steady, prepared, not defensive. Because I finally understood something I hadn't before. Silence protects you until it doesn't, and when the moment comes to speak, what you say and how you say it determines whether you walk away whole or fractured. I didn't know exactly how the conversation would unfold, but I knew this much. By the end of it, the story they told about me would never sound the same again, and some people I once trusted, were about to realize that underestimating a quiet woman comes with a cost they never budgeted for. The meeting was set for Thursday evening, but the weight of it settled on me days before. Not as anxiety, more like awareness. When you've spent years observing people instead of being centered by them, you develop a sharp sense for moments that will change how you're seen. This was one of those moments. I arrived early. Of course I did. The room was small, tucked behind the main office, neutral walls, folding chairs, a long table with a pitcher of water no one ever touched. It was the kind of room meant for quiet correction, not confrontation, for smoothing things over, for keeping discomfort contained. 3 people were already there when I walked in. 2 elders and a woman who served as a liaison, someone whose job was to support families in transition. I recognized the careful distance in her smile immediately. "Camille," one of the elders said warmly, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," I replied, and meant it. We sat, hands folded, postures polite. The conversation opened gently, as these things always do. "We wanted to check on you," the elder began. "There's been a lot of talk, a lot of concern." "I understand," I said. The liaison leaned forward. "Some people are confused. They're struggling to reconcile what they're hearing with the Camille they know." "That makes sense," I replied calmly. "They don't know all of me." A pause followed, not uncomfortable, but telling. The second elder cleared his throat. "Your husband feels blindsided." I nodded slowly. "He should." The liaison blinked. "That's a strong response." "No," I said evenly, "it's an honest one." I could feel the room recalibrating. This wasn't the conversation they expected. They were waiting for remorse, for justification, for emotion they could categorize and manage. I offered none of it. "I want to be clear," I continued. "I didn't come here to debate perception. I came to clarify facts." One of the elders shifted in his seat. "Go on." So I did. I explained, not emotionally, not defensively, how I'd noticed patterns, how joint funds were moved without consent, how contracts bore inconsistencies, how timelines overlapped in ways that demanded attention. I didn't name agencies, I didn't dramatize outcomes, I simply outlined process. When I finished, the room was quiet. The liaison spoke first. "Why didn't you come to leadership sooner?" "Because leadership doesn't investigate, they counsel. I needed accountability." That answer landed hard. One of the elders sighed. "You understand this has affected the community." "Yes," I said, "but harm doesn't become acceptable because exposure is uncomfortable." They exchanged glances. "We're concerned that people feel this could have been handled privately." I leaned back slightly. Private handling protected him, not me. Silence again. That was the moment everything shifted, not because they suddenly agreed with me, but because they realized I wasn't asking for permission, I wasn't seeking absolution, I wasn't negotiating my dignity. I stood to leave when the meeting concluded, polite, composed, unmoved. "Camille," the liaison said softly as I reached the door, "people are afraid." "I know," I replied. So was I for a long time. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting loosely in my lap, letting the quiet settle. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't defended myself, and yet I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The next morning, something changed. Messages arrived, not many, but enough. Short notes, careful words. "I didn't know." "I see you." "I'm sorry I assumed." They didn't come from everyone, not even most, but they came from people that mattered, people who listened instead of reacting. And then came the silence from others, the kind that tells you they've chosen distance over discomfort. I accepted both. Later that week, I received confirmation of something I'd suspected but hadn't yet seen in writing. His social standing was collapsing alongside his professional. Invitations rescinded, leadership roles quietly reassigned, people distancing themselves without explanation. Consequences don't announce themselves, they unfold. One afternoon, while reviewing notes for a client call, my phone buzzed with a notification. His name. Not a call, not a message, a forwarded article. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it would say, but the fact that someone else had sent it, unsolicited, told me everything. The story was no longer his to control. I set the phone down and returned to my work, because while he was watching his life contract, mine was expanding, quietly, steadily, without spectacle. And for the first time, the community wasn't watching me with suspicion. They were watching with uncertainty. They didn't know who I was anymore. And that uncertainty, that was freedom. But the real shift, the one that would make everything irreversible, was still ahead. And it would come from a place none of us expected. The unexpected place turned out to be work. Not mine, but his. Not the business he'd built his identity around, but the quieter network beneath it. The vendors, the consultants, the people who'd watched things not quite add up and told themselves it wasn't their problem. Until it was. The email arrived on a Monday morning, forwarded from someone I barely knew. No greeting, no explanation, just a subject line and an attachment. Request for information. Compliance review. I opened it slowly, already feeling the shift in my body. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't social consequence. This was structural. The kind of inquiry that doesn't go away with charm or connections. I sat back in my chair and exhaled, not in relief, recognition. When institutions start asking questions, it means enough people have stopped protecting you. By noon, I heard from 3 different directions that his office was in chaos. Meetings canceled, staff sent home early, phones unanswered. No one wanted to be the last person standing next to a man under scrutiny. That's when he finally broke his silence. Not with anger, with fear. He called from a blocked number. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Camille," he said, his voice stripped down to something raw and unfamiliar. "We need to talk, please." "What do you need?" I asked calmly. "I don't understand how this got so big," he said. "They're pulling everything, contracts, emails, years back." "I understand," I replied. He paused. "You do?" "Yes." That silence stretched, heavy, revealing. "I never thought you'd go this far," he said quietly. I considered that. "I never thought you'd leave me exposed." He swallowed audibly. "This could destroy everything." "It already did," I said. "You just hadn't noticed yet." His breath hitched. "What do you want?" There it was, the question men ask when they finally realize control is gone. "I want distance, and for you to stop contacting me." "You can't just," he started. "I can, and I am." I ended the call. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. That surprised me. There was no satisfaction in the exchange, no anger left to release, just finality. Later that day, I met with a client, my 3rd that month, a woman my age, worn thin by years of carrying someone else's chaos. She spoke softly, like she didn't trust the room to hold her truth. "I don't want revenge. I just want peace." So did I, and this is how I got it. We talked through her options, not hypotheticals, not fantasies, practical steps, documentation, boundaries, time frames. She listened intently, eyes sharp with something new, possibility. When she left, she hugged me briefly. "You don't speak like someone who's bitter." "I'm not. I'm finished." That distinction mattered. The next development came fast. His name appeared in a trade publication, not prominently, buried, carefully worded, but visible to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. "Leadership changes pending review." That was the phrase. I read it once, then closed the browser. The woman he'd left me for disappeared entirely from the narrative. Social media scrubbed, accounts deactivated, no more sightings, no more whispers. She was gone in the way people vanish when association becomes liability. I wondered briefly if she'd known how far it went. Then I let the thought pass. Understanding isn't required for closure. One evening, as I was locking up my apartment after a long day, I noticed something else shift, not around me, but inside me. The vigilance I'd carried for so long had begun to loosen. My shoulders weren't tight. My thoughts weren't scanning for threat. I was present. That night, I dreamed without interruption in years. The following week, I received an invitation, not from church, not from old friends, from a local women's organization. They'd heard about my work, about my approach. They wanted me to lead a small workshop on financial recovery and quiet strategy. I stared at the email for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I recognized the moment. Visibility, the thing I'd avoided for years because it felt unsafe. I accepted. The day of the workshop, I stood in front of 12 women seated in a circle. No stage, no microphone, just eye contact and shared understanding. I'm not here to tell you how to destroy anyone. I'm here to help you protect yourselves. Heads nodded, pens moved. Something shifted in the room. That night, as I drove home, my phone buzzed with one final update. His resignation had been requested. Not announced, requested. I pulled over and sat there, hazard lights blinking softly in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. Because this wasn't about watching him fall. It was about realizing I no longer needed to watch at all. The woman they never saw coming had already stepped into her next life. And the last piece, the one that would close this chapter completely, was closer than I thought. Closure doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or apologies. It shows up quietly, disguised as a decision you didn't realize you were ready to make. For me, it came the morning I deleted the last folder bearing his name. I hesitated before clicking delete, not because I needed the files. I didn't. Everything that mattered had already been secured, duplicated, archived where it needed to be. The hesitation came from habit, from years of believing I needed to stay alert, prepared, vigilant. Then I realized something. Vigilance had served its purpose. I pressed the button and watched the folder disappear. That same morning, I received confirmation of what had been circulating quietly for weeks. His resignation wasn't optional anymore. It was final, effective immediately. No farewell announcement, no graceful exit, just absence. People tend to romanticize downfall, but it rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative, cold, procedural, final. I closed my laptop and made breakfast. By now, my consulting work had taken on a rhythm. Referrals came from women who spoke softly at first, then more confidently as they realized they weren't being judged or rushed. I didn't advertise. I didn't brand myself aggressively. I worked through trust, through results. One afternoon, after a particularly long session, I sat alone in my apartment and noticed something new. I wasn't tired in the same way anymore. The exhaustion that once lived in my bones, the kind that comes from anticipating someone else's chaos, was gone. In its place was a manageable fatigue, earned, clean. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message I hadn't expected. It was from his sister. "I owe you an apology," it read. "I didn't know everything. I should have asked more questions." I stared at the screen, weighing the words. They weren't cruel, they weren't defensive, but they were late. I typed a response, then erased it, then typed again. "I hope you find clarity," I finally wrote. "I'm not available for conversation." I sent it and blocked the number. Boundaries don't need explanations. A few days later, the final administrative notice arrived. The investigation had concluded. Actions taken, files closed, language careful and precise as institutions prefer. I read it slowly, then folded the paper and placed it in a drawer I no longer opened daily. That night, I attended a small gathering with women I'd come to know through my work. No speeches, no testimonies, just food, laughter, and a shared understanding that survival doesn't have to look like suffering forever. One woman leaned over and said, "You're different from what I expected." I smiled. Most quiet women are. On my way home, I drove with the windows down, city air brushing against my skin. I felt present in my body, grounded in a way I hadn't been before, not because everything was perfect, but because it was mine. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment longer than necessary. For years, my life had been shaped around someone else's decisions, someone else's risks, someone else's need for control. I'd mistaken endurance for loyalty, silence for safety. Now I understood something far more important. The most dangerous women aren't loud. They don't threaten. They don't warn. They watch. They learn. They prepare. And when the moment comes, they act. Not to destroy, but to protect themselves so completely that the person who underestimated them becomes irrelevant. I didn't win because he lost. I won because I stopped living in reaction to him. And as I stepped out of my car and into my building, keys warm in my hand, I knew the truth with a clarity that needed no validation. The woman they never saw coming wasn't hiding anymore. She had simply arrived, and she wasn't going back. I thought the hardest part would be over once the investigation closed and his name stopped showing up in conversations that had nothing to do with me. I thought finality would feel like relief, and in some ways it did. But what no one tells you is that when the noise finally dies down, you're left alone with the quiet truth of who you are now and who you can no longer pretend to be. The invitations changed after that. They weren't cautious anymore. They were intentional. Women reached out who didn't want advice. They wanted language, words for the things they felt but couldn't yet name, for the tension of staying too long, for the guilt of leaving without exploding first, for the fear of being judged more harshly for surviving intelligently than for suffering loudly. I understood them in a way that surprised even me. One afternoon, after a workshop ran long, a woman stayed behind while the others filtered out. She sat across from me, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes rimmed red but steady. "How did you know when to stop waiting?" she asked. I didn't answer right away, because the truth wasn't clean or inspiring. It wasn't a moment of courage or clarity. It was a moment of exhaustion so complete it stripped the fantasy away. I knew when I realized waiting was costing me more than leaving, I said finally. She nodded like something heavy had finally been set down. That night, I went home and stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than usual. I studied my face, the familiar angles, the softened lines, the eyes that no longer scanned for threat out of habit. I wasn't who I had been when this started, but I wasn't someone unrecognizable either. I was refined by truth. That's when the email arrived. Not hostile, not dramatic, just formal enough to make my chest tighten. Request for statement, related civil matter. I read it twice, then a third time. It wasn't criminal, that part was done. This was something else, a civil proceeding tied to damages, liability, restitution beyond what had already been addressed, a final unraveling of everything he'd tried to build on top of my silence. I leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly. This wasn't about me being pulled back in. This was about making sure there was no version of the story left unfinished. The next few days passed in a careful rhythm, preparation without panic, review without rumination. I answered questions, provided documents already categorized months ago. I noticed how different it felt this time, not like defense, but like confirmation. One evening, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Camille," a man said gently, "this is regarding the pending civil action. There's one detail we need clarity on." I listened, responded, clarified. Then he added something unexpected. "He's contesting part of the claim." I laughed softly, surprised by the sound. "On what grounds?" I asked. "He says you benefited indirectly, that you waited intentionally." I closed my eyes. Of course he did it. That narrative, the quiet woman as the mastermind, was the only one that allowed him to avoid accountability. If I was calculating, then he was merely unlucky. If I was cold, then he was the victim of manipulation rather than the architect of his own collapse. "I didn't wait for opportunity," I said calmly. "I waited for proof." There was a pause. "Thank you," the man said. "That's helpful." After the call ended, I sat very still, not shaken, not angry, aware. This was the last test, not of my evidence, but of my resolve. The moment where staying quiet would be easier than standing firm, where disengaging completely would be tempting. But I didn't come this far to leave truth unfinished. That night, I dreamed of walking through a house with no doors, just open rooms filled with light, no hiding places, no shadows. I woke with my heart steady and my mind clear. The following week, I received a single-page notice confirming what I already knew. A hearing date had been set. Final review, final statements, final accountability. I folded the paper and placed it beside my planner, not as a threat, but as a marker, an endpoint, because when this was over, there would be nothing left tying me to the woman I used to be or the man who never saw me clearly. And for the first time, I felt something close to anticipation, not fear, not revenge, readiness. Because the quietest women don't just know when to strike, they know when to stand, speak once, and walk away whole without ever looking back. And the last word in this story? It hadn't been spoken yet. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early enough that the city still felt half asleep when I arrived. I wore a simple suit, nothing sharp, nothing symbolic. Neutral colors, clean lines, the kind of clothing that didn't ask for attention because it didn't need it. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me. I sat in the waiting area, hands folded loosely in my lap, watching people pass by carrying folders thick with unfinished stories. Anxiety moved loudly around me, but it didn't settle in my body. I had already lived through the worst part, the not knowing, the doubting, the years of silence that required constant self-erasure. This was just formality. When they called my name, I stood without hesitation. The room was smaller than I expected. No audience, no drama, just a few people seated at a table, papers arranged neatly, pens ready. My ex-husband wasn't there. His attorney was. That felt appropriate. By now, his absence had become a pattern. I answered questions carefully, clearly. Once again, I didn't accuse, I explained. I clarified timelines, I explained decisions, I stated facts without ornament. At one point, someone asked why I hadn't confronted him earlier knowing what I knew. I didn't know everything then, I said, and partial knowledge isn't protection. They nodded. Notes were taken. Another question followed. Did you intend for the outcome to be this severe? No, I replied. I intended for the truth to be complete. That distinction mattered. When it was over, there was no gavel slam, no announcement, just a quiet acknowledgement that everything required had been said, that the record was clear. Final determinations would be issued in writing. I left the building and stood on the steps for a moment, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I felt lighter, not because I'd won something, but because nothing remained unresolved. The last thread was cut. Days later, the notice arrived. Brief, precise, final. Liability assigned, claims upheld. No further action required from me. I placed the letter in a folder labeled closed, slid it into a drawer, and didn't look at it again. Life didn't explode into joy after that. It softened. Mornings became slower. My work deepened. The women I mentored didn't need me to be inspirational. They needed me to be honest. I told them the truth, that strength doesn't always announce itself, that survival doesn't always look heroic, and that quiet women are often the most dangerous, not because they want revenge, but because they refuse to be erased. I moved into my new home a month later. Sunlight poured through the windows like permission. I unpacked carefully, placing each item where it felt right instead of where it had always gone. I cooked meals without rushing. I slept without bracing for interruption. I didn't speak publicly about what happened. I didn't need to. The people who mattered understood. The ones who didn't were no longer my responsibility. Sometimes I think about the version of myself they underestimated, the woman they thought was harmless, forgettable, easy to step over. I don't feel anger toward her. I feel gratitude. She kept me safe long enough to become this version of myself. The woman who watches, the woman who prepares, the woman who knows when silence is strategy and when it's time to speak once and be done. I didn't destroy anyone's life. I saved my own. And if there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Never confuse quiet with weakness, never assume stillness means ignorance, and never underestimate a woman who has learned how to survive without applause. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.